I'm Jake. I've seen it all on the road, from county fairs to desert yard sales. But if there's one type of town that gives you chills, it's the one that's too far out of the way. The one that has no real reason to exist. This happened to me in Blackwood Falls, Colorado. A 40-minute detour off I-70, climbing up a forgotten mountain road. The trees were ponderosa pines, giant and old, and the mist was creeping in. The air smelled of mold and wet earth. I arrived on a Tuesday, early in the afternoon. The sun was filtering through, but the town was a sad postcard. 24 wooden houses, a single swing set quietly creaking in an empty yard, and a gas station with pumps covered by torn tarps. The first thing that hit me wasn't the silence, but the absence of color. Everything was gray, brown, or dark green. But more importantly, there were no traces of recent life. No garbage bags in the bins, no scattered toys, no fresh tire tracks leading into the driveways. I parked my truck, the rolling store, next to the only open business, a dusty general store. I went inside. The place was run by an old man, thin and leather-skinned. He introduced himself as Ed. Ed was behind a counter, reading a worn-out coverless book without looking up. I showed him my best merchandise. Small tools, repair kits, practical things. Ed just shook his head. "We don't need any of that, young man. We're already equipped." I asked him about the lack of people. He said without stopping his reading, "They're busy. It's harvest time. They have their farms up the mountain." It felt like a flimsy excuse. I didn't see a single tractor. I stayed there for a while, just to see if anyone else would come in. Nobody. The only sound was the slow, agonizing tick-tock of an old wall clock stuck at 3:17. I left and went to the only house that looked truly inhabited. On the porch, an elderly woman was knitting. She smiled at me, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. I offered her some handmade soaps. She said in a very sweet voice, "They're pretty, but here we don't use anything that isn't from here." She closed the door without a slam. It was the same refusal, but with a stranger reason. They don't consume anything from the outside. The town wasn't rejecting me. It was rejecting my things. I spent the night in the store's parking lot. The town was so dark that my flashlight barely penetrated the mist. The terror I felt wasn't active. It was the sense of being in a place that is being wound down. The next morning, I went back to the store for coffee. Ed was still behind the counter, but this time he wasn't reading. He was staring intently at the wall clock. I ordered a coffee. While he poured it, I asked him about the clock. It seemed so slow. Ed looked at me for the first time, his eyes a pale, expressionless blue. "That clock," Ed said, his voice barely a whisper, "has been broken for 20 years. It's stuck at 3:17. What you're hearing, that's just inertia." That froze me. I had heard the slow, agonizing tick-tock all the previous afternoon. It wasn't stuck. It was running, but incredibly slowly, and Ed was lying to me with absolute composure about something so trivial. If they lie to you about time, what else are they lying about? I decided to walk through the town under an excuse, looking for the post office. I walked down the main street, paying attention to the details that were missing. I checked the garbage dumpster behind the old church. It was completely empty. Not just empty, but clean. Not a single stain, not a single wrapper. Where was the waste? Where was the garbage from 24 houses? I slipped around the back of an abandoned house. I found the refrigerator. It was clean inside, empty. But on a small kitchen table, I found a broken, open package of cookies. It was full of mold and insects. It was the only evidence of decomposition I had seen. The only thing the people of Blackwood Falls had allowed to rot. I got out of there. As I returned to the store, I passed by Ed's house. And there on the porch sat Ed. He wasn't in the store anymore. He was sitting in the same rocking chair as the old woman, not knitting, just staring at the road. When he saw me, he simply raised his hand, a slow, almost robotic wave. I asked him if he had teleported. He smiled, and his smile was the most disheartening thing I had ever seen. He said, "Time is different here, Jake. You ought to go home." His presence in two places almost simultaneously, and his smile made me feel that it wasn't the town that was wrong, but that the rules of physics had slackened a bit just for me. The incident with Ed confirmed to me that Blackwood Falls wasn't paranormal, but it wasn't normal either. It was the people. I decided the only way to break the silence was to do something that forced them to interact with me. I went back to my truck and opened the box of my most valuable merchandise, a high-end set of kitchen knives. The most expensive ones. I went to the old woman's house. I knocked. She opened the door with the same tight smile. I showed her the knives. They're Damascus steel, ma'am. The finest. For the kitchen. She looked at them. And for the first time I saw desire in her eyes. A flicker. A break in her monotony. They're pretty, she said. How much do they cost? I told her the price. She looked at me and the smile returned, rigid. Oh, we couldn't have them. The ones we use are given to us. Given to you by who? I asked. She just shrugged, but behind her in the dark hallway of the house, I saw a shadow move. A tall, silent figure, which I couldn't make out. It wasn't family. It was someone there to supervise the conversation. I told her I'd be back in an hour to think about the knives. I left, but instead of driving away, I parked my truck on the main road in plain sight. I waited half an hour. Then I saw a child rush out of a house. A boy about 8, the only one I had seen. He was crying. He ran toward Ed's house. The boy was sobbing uncontrollably on Ed's porch, banging on the door. Ed opened the door, and the light from inside was so dim I could barely distinguish him. The boy was screaming, "I can't find it, Ed." "It's gone." And Ed, with his flat, calm voice, replied, "Be patient, son. They reintegrate what is missing. They'll make it reappear, but you have to wait quietly." The boy stopped crying instantly. He looked up at him. Ed gently grabbed his shoulder and ushered him inside the house. The door closed. The phrase drilled into my mind. They reintegrate what is missing. It wasn't that there was no waste. It was that it was collected. It wasn't that the clock was broken. It was allowed to tick until 3:17. It wasn't that they didn't want my knives. It was that someone provided the tools they were supposed to use. The boy's panic was the terror of not being able to find what the town had taken. In Blackwood Falls, people neither generated nor bought anything. They simply existed within an inventory maintained by a silent authority. And that authority was the one that had taken their waste, their emotions, and perhaps their time. The idea that a silent, logistical authority maintained this town in a state of artificial perfection terrified me more than any devil. I went back to the truck. There was no point in going back to Ed's house. But I remembered something I had seen at the back of the general store. The store had a large brickbat wall, and on that wall, there was a small, low, square metal door used for deliveries. It was secured with a rusty padlock. I approached the door. I didn't try to open it. I just touched the cold, rough metal. There was a tiny gap just below the lock. I crouched down and put my eye to it. The interior was dark. It smelled of dust and the sweet metallic odor I had smelled near the church. But in the gloom, I saw something that made my heart stop. There was a perfect line of objects stacked against the opposite wall. They weren't random piles. They were hundreds of identical items placed with military precision. They were table cutlery, metal forks, all identical, with the tines pointing outward, lined up against a wall 2 meters high. I didn't understand. Why such a massive quantity of identical forks? But as I stared at the line of cutlery, I noticed a movement. It wasn't the shadow of a person. It was a subtle, dry movement at the top of the stack. A fork that moved barely a millimeter, as if it had been placed there a second ago and hadn't fully settled yet. I recoiled abruptly. They weren't just cutlery. They were the spare parts for the people of Blackwood Falls. They were the forks that fall down the drain. The ones that get bent. The ones the boy couldn't find. The authority wasn't just removing waste. It was maintaining a perfect inventory, ready to replace whatever was lost. And what moved wasn't the air. It was the fork. It was being reintegrated into the inventory at that very moment. The slow tick-tock wasn't inertia. It was the processing time of the people of Blackwood Falls. I ran to the truck. As I drove out of town, I saw Ed again. He was on the main road, standing in the middle of the yellow line, watching the vehicle drive away. This time he didn't wave. He just stood there like a cardboard cutout, waiting to be removed and replaced if he failed his function. I sped up 75 miles an hour until the truck was shaking. I needed that town to be a memory, not a current reality. But the certainty followed me. The horror wasn't a monster. It was the logistics behind that town's life. I stopped at the first rest area I found. It was isolated, next to an empty turnout. I needed a moment to breathe. I got out of the truck. I took my coffee, which was now cold. And as I looked at the foam cup, I noticed something. The cup had a small crack near the rim. A clean, dry crack that wasn't there before. I ran my finger over the crack. And then I realized the paradox. If Blackwood Falls removed all waste, why did they allow my vehicle to leave the town with a defective object? Why didn't they stop me and replace my cup? It was a liberation. The crack meant that the town had a boundary. Their control ended at the geographical edge, or perhaps at the moment when its inhabitants stopped believing they could control you. I took the cup and threw it away. I felt a little better. But then, as I got back into the truck, I noticed something in the side rearview mirror. The mirror was dusty from the Blackwood Falls road, and in that dust, there was something that made me swallow hard. A small, blurry circle with two very faint lines extending downward. Not 3 lines, but 2. It wasn't the town symbol. It was my fingerprint in the mirror's dust, slightly rotated, creating the illusion of the pattern I had been looking for. I frantically wiped the mirror. But the image was burned into my mind, the temptation to see a pattern, even when there is none. The real terror of Blackwood Falls wasn't their logistics, but the doubt they injected into my mind. The doubt of whether its inhabitants were acting by an external force, or whether they had simply decided, by coordinated free will, to live a life so reduced, so devoid of waste and failure that it seemed like the work of a logistical god. I never went back. Sometimes in my work I find a house with peeling paint and an overgrown yard, and I breathe a sigh of relief. Imperfection is my refuge now. But sometimes, in a store in an unfamiliar town, I see a clock stopped at 3:17, and I wonder if the tick-tock I hear is just the inertia of my own sanity. Or if the people of Blackwood Falls are still waiting for something I'm missing to be reintegrated into my life.